Hello everyone, welcome back to the Whiskey Pour. I hope you're having a good day today. My name is Danny and today I want to talk about something that I think is not always explained properly in whiskey, and that is cask types. When you taste a whiskey, about 60 to 70% of the flavour actually comes from the wood they matured in, not from the still. So the wood and the cask type that the whiskey matured in is really important. So today what I want to do is go through some of those main cask types and talk about how they affect the liquid that's maturing inside, and also some of the different types of oak that casks can be made of and how that might affect the flavour. To me personally, as a whiskey drinker, this kind of thing really fascinates me, so you guys will let me know if it's the same for you, and I guess let's just get right into it. I want to first talk about the types of oak and where they're from and what difference that makes. So the main oak you'll see in whiskey aging is American oak. It is packed with vanillin, which is a compound that literally gives vanilla flavour as well as coconutty flavours, honey notes. By law, bourbon has to be aged in brand new charred American oak barrels. Once those barrels have done their job on the bourbon, they cannot be reused for bourbon, because for bourbon you have to use new charred American oak casks. So the vast majority of those are bought by Scotland and then used to mature Scotch whisky. A very high percentage of whisky maturing in Scotland is in American oak ex-bourbon barrels. So American oak is a very big backbone of Scotch whisky. European oak, on the other hand, grows more slowly. It's tighter grained and more tannic, and that means that the whisky that matures in it is going to be slightly spicier. It's going to have slightly more structure and more grip. Most traditional sherry casks, especially things like Oloroso and similar, are made using European oak, which is one of the reasons that those whiskies tend to be richer, a little bit nuttier, a little bit spicier. Properly seasoned oak casks can be really expensive, up to about 10 times more than a used bourbon barrel. So sherry seasoned European oak casks are used much more selectively for whiskey, and whiskey made in these barrels tends to cost more. I do quickly want to mention Japanese Mizunara in this section. It's not something you'll see every day, but it's worth mentioning. It's one of my favourite woods for whiskey to be made in. Mizunara started being used in Japan during and after World War II. Importers couldn't easily import wood from America or Europe, so they decided to use their own stocks. It turns out that this wood gave the whiskey really nice sandalwood, incense, deep notes, and it worked really well. The catch is that Mizunara oak is a nightmare to work with. It's very porous, so barrels can leak, and the trees themselves often need 150 to 200 years to grow, so it's very hard to get hold of Mizunara oak. So yeah, Mizunara is definitely rare and expensive, but if you try it, you'll taste that very distinctive note. It's very different, but it's really great. You only usually see it as a finish to a whiskey, but when you taste it, the flavours are unlike anything else. Okay, so that's types of oak done. Let's talk about types of casks, and I'm gonna start with ex-bourbon casks. As I mentioned, bourbon by law has to be aged in charred new American oak barrels. So once they're done with these casks, the vast majority are shipped off to Scotland, to Ireland, to other places for them to make whiskey, because the flavours that bourbon barrel imparts is really great. On the nose, bourbon cask whiskies tend to be lighter and fresher. A lot of coconut notes, vanilla notes, sometimes you get lemon or apple and pear, and then when you get to the palate, you often get this sweetness and creaminess that kind of works with the spirit without overpowering it. As I mentioned earlier, the vast majority of Scotch spends at least some of its time, if not all of its time, in ex-bourbon casks. So it's a really important part of Scotch whisky making. Next up, let's talk about Oloroso sherry casks. Now, Oloroso sherry is a dry, oxidative style of sherry made in Jerez in Spain. It's made from Palomino grapes aged without the flor protective layer, so it turns sort of darker, richer and nuttier. It's very full-bodied, lots of dried fruit, nut, deep caramel notes. Sherry cask whiskey you often hear being described as having notes of Christmas cake or fruit loaf or dried fruits like medjool dates. It's definitely darker and richer and more old-fashioned style in a way compared to bourbon cask. There also tends to be more tannin and spice, and you often get a finish of baking spice, cinnamon, clovey notes. As I mentioned earlier, sherry casks are definitely not cheap. They can cost 10 times the price of a bourbon cask. cask, and sherry cask whiskey is definitely associated more with luxury whiskey. Brands like Macallan use Oloroso casks to create that really deep, luxurious flavour. So Oloroso cask whiskey is definitely associated with more high-end, expensive whiskey. Pedro Ximénez casks, or PX casks as you might have heard them referred to as, is another type of sherry. To make PX sherry, PX grapes are taken and dried on mats until they essentially turn into raisins, and that really concentrates the sugar. So when the wine is made, it's very syrupy and sweet. PX has a lot of flavour similarities with Oloroso sherry casks, so you still get a lot of dried fruits and chocolate, sometimes espresso notes, but PX tends to have an almost thicker dessert-like mouthfeel to it, whereas Oloroso is slightly drier. Yeah, PX tends to almost taste stickier and sweeter, whereas Oloroso still has those very sweet notes, but you get more of that spice and those orangey notes, and sometimes oaky notes as well. It's quite hard to explain that difference in words, but if you try an Oloroso whiskey with a PX whiskey side by side, you can really taste that nuance. Cheers, by the way. Next, let's talk about port casks. Now, port is a fortified wine from Portugal, usually from the Douro Valley. There are a lot of styles, but very roughly, Ruby Port is bright and red tasting and very fruity. Tawny Port spends more time in wood, so it leans a little bit more oaky. It's a bit nuttier, more caramel notes. When whiskey is matured or finished in port casks, you often get red fruit notes, so strawberry and cherry and raspberry, and you often also get plum or dark fruit notes, often chocolate, and sometimes more tannin, so a little bit more grip and spice that sort of lingers. It often smells winey, which is a funny thing to say because obviously port is a fortified wine, but whereas some wine casks can give a whiskey just fruit notes, port casks often smell winey on the whiskey, if you understand what I'm saying. If you like the sort of darker red fruit side of whiskey, port cask whiskies could be a really good option for you. I do also want to mention wine casks in general, so Bordeaux wine, sometimes you get Pinot Noir cask. There are lots of different types of wine cask, but generally they do all have some similarities in the flavours that they pass on to the whiskey. You often get sort of mixed red berries, usually some spice, again often some tannin, and you can often feel that at the back of your throat and it kind of lingers. It's a very different taste and feeling to tasting baking spice and whiskey. It kind of, you sort of feel it more around this area of your throat. I'm definitely not explaining that very well. Bourbon and sherry casks can often feel quite familiar, whereas wine casks, for me, tend to feel a little bit more wild almost. When wine casks are done well, you get this really nice, structured, yet still fun burst of flavour on the whiskey. If wine casks are not handled properly, they can sometimes slightly overpower the whiskey. So that is where a good cask selection and good blending skills really do matter in whiskey, because you can definitely go very wrong with any cask really, but you do sometimes tend to find it with wine casks. A quick note on finishing versus full maturation. Some whiskies are aged in one type of cask for their whole life. So for example, fully bourbon cask matured or fully sherry cask matured. Others are just finished in a certain type of cask, which means they start off in one cask, often do most of their life in that cask, and then to add a different flavour note, they get transferred to another cask just to finish it off and make it perfect. You'll often see sherry finish or port finish, etc. on a bottle of whiskey, and that just means it spent most of its life usually in bourbon casks and then just got transferred to add that extra layer of flavour. There are great whiskey options in all of these cask types I've mentioned, and to be honest, I am a fan of whiskey aged in all of the ones I've listed. But do let me know if there is a whiskey cask that you are specifically a fan of. Are you a sherry person? Do you prefer things when they're matured or finished in red wine casks? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. A quick note again, I know I've said this before, but I'm so grateful for everyone on YouTube who leaves such kind comments and engages and writes such interesting things and teaches me things about whiskey. I'm so grateful for all of it, and I really love the YouTube community we've built here. Anyway, that's enough from me. I hope you have a good rest of your day. I'll see you next week. Follow for more.